For 35 years, I designed logistics and transport systems for the most volatile, lethal chemical compounds on Earth. I have overseen the movement of industrial solvents that can dissolve human bone and neurotoxins that can stop a heart in seconds if a hazmat seal fails. I survived all of it without a single burn or misstep. But as I stood in my own kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, staring at my 34-year-old son-in-law, I realized my luck had finally run out. I was being poisoned, and I was expected to swallow it with a glass of tap water. The realization didn't come with a dramatic collapse or a sudden gasp for air. It came through the brutal, undeniable language of chemistry. But before the revelation, there was only the exhaustion. For the past 3 weeks, my body had been failing me. A creeping, heavy lethargy had settled into my bones, making my limbs feel like they were filled with wet concrete. I am 64 years old. I built Pendleton Supply and Logistics from a single leased freight truck into a regional powerhouse. I know what natural wear and tear feels like. I know the ache of a long week. But this was different. This was a high-frequency vibration running through my fingers. It was a hollow, dragging thud against my ribs, a skipped heartbeat that left me breathless just from walking down the stairs. I gripped the edge of the cold marble kitchen island to steady my trembling hands. Sitting across from me was Julian. He was married to my only daughter, Chloe, and held the title of Chief Operating Officer at my company. Julian treated every morning like a carefully curated performance. Today, he wore a sleek black racing-style jacket over a fitted t-shirt, his version of modern executive attire. It was a deliberate contrast to the steel-toed, blue-collar reality of the supply chain world I had built. "You're pale again, Arthur," Julian said, not looking up from the financial metrics on his tablet. His voice dripped with a patronizing sympathy that always set my teeth on edge. "You're moving like you're walking underwater." "Just stiff," I rasped. My voice lacked its usual gravelly resonance. I reached for my coffee mug, forcing my hand to remain steady. Chloe walked up beside me, her brow creased with genuine worry. At 31, my daughter still possessed the sheltered optimism of someone who had never seen the foundation of her life crack. I had spent decades absorbing Julian's arrogance, his reckless spending, and his aggressive push for control, all to keep the waters calm in her home. My fatal flaw was confusing provision with protection. "It's more than stiff, Dad," Chloe said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You look terrible. You didn't sleep at all." "I have the Dallas freight negotiations this week," I said. "I've handled those regional directors for 20 years. I just need to get through Friday." Julian finally set his tablet face down. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "Arthur, we need to have a realistic conversation. The Dallas contract is 8 figures. The company needs sharp, aggressive leadership in that room. Not someone who looks like he might need a paramedic mid-pitch." He slid my weekly plastic pill organizer across the marble counter toward me. "Let me fly to Dallas," Julian insisted, his eyes locking onto mine with a hungry, impatient intensity. "Let me handle the final signatures. You can stay here, manage your health, and rest. I've got it covered. Take your medicine, Arthur, for Chloe's sake." "He's right, Dad," Chloe chimed in. "You promised me you'd start stepping back, please." I looked at my daughter. Then I looked at Julian. I popped open the Tuesday slot of the organizer and tapped the single small white oval into my palm. Lisinopril. 20 milligrams, a standard low-dose ACE inhibitor for mild hypertension. I had taken the exact same medication, filled by the exact same independent pharmacy, for 6 years. The pharmacy was owned by Trent Vance, a man Julian frequently played golf with. I tossed the pill into my mouth, brought a glass of water to my lips, and swallowed. Usually the pill was entirely inert, chalky and tasteless. But this morning, the water washed away the outer pharmaceutical binder a fraction of a second before it went down my throat. The raw compound hit the receptors on the back of my palate. I froze. My hand stopped midair, the glass hovering inches from my mouth. It was a sharp, astringent, highly metallic tang. It was bitter enough to make my salivary glands contract instantly. As a chemical engineer, your brain catalogs sensory data permanently. You never forget how a compound reacts. The taste in my mouth was not a medicinal filler. It tasted exactly the way silver halide smells when it reacts violently with developer fluid in a darkroom tray. It was the distinct, undeniable profile of a heavy metal organic compound. "Dad?" Chloe asked, her voice pulling me back from the edge of the abyss. "Are you okay? You just blanked out." I forced myself to swallow the remaining water, washing the bitter residue down my throat. I looked at Julian. He was watching me intently, his eyes tracking the movement of my throat. He wasn't looking at me with concern. He was looking at me the way a technician watches a gauge, waiting for a machine to finally break down. "Fine," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Just went down the wrong pipe. I'll stay local today, Julian. You prep the Dallas files." Julian smiled. It was a tight, triumphant expression. "Smart decision, Arthur. Just rest." I left the house and drove to the corporate office, the metallic ghost still clinging to my tongue. By noon, the physical toll of that morning's pill hit me like a sledgehammer. I sat in my office overlooking the loading bays, my heart misfiring, a cold sweat breaking out across my neck. I spent the afternoon watching Julian through the glass walls of his office. He was pacing, pointing at charts, acting as if the transition of power had already been finalized. He looked energetic, reckless. I realized I wasn't just observing an ambitious successor waiting for me to retire. I was looking at a man who had artificially accelerated the timeline. I left work early, returning to the empty house. Chloe and Julian were out at a charity dinner in the city, spending the salary I provided. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight down into my basement darkroom. I turned on the harsh overhead fluorescent lights, rejecting the comforting shadows of the red safe light. The air smelled of acetic acid and fixer. It was a place of absolute chemical certainty. I pulled my prescription bottle from my jacket pocket. The label was correct. The independent pharmacy logo, Trent Vance's Pharmacy, was printed neatly on the side. I poured the remaining pills onto my wooden workbench. They looked perfectly normal. Small, white, scored down the middle. But I knew the rules of chemistry. A reaction requires a catalyst. The sudden, catastrophic degradation of my physical strength, the cardiovascular tremors, the heavy metal taste on my tongue. These were not the symptoms of natural aging. They were data points. It was time for my evening dose. I picked up one of the white ovals. I held it between my thumb and forefinger. My hands were violently shaking, but my mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The fog of denial had burned away, leaving only the cold, mechanical focus of an engineer troubleshooting a fatal flaw in a system. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of standard vitamin C supplements I kept for cold season. They were roughly the same size and color. I put the vitamin C tablet into my mouth and swallowed it dry. Then, I picked up a small vintage aluminum 35mm film canister resting beside my heavy Zeiss Otis camera lens. I popped the metal lid off. I dropped Julian's prescribed white pill inside. It hit the aluminum bottom with a soft, hollow clink. I pressed the lid back on, sealing it tight. I didn't have the certified laboratory proof yet. I only had a hypothesis. But as I set the aluminum canister carefully in the center of the workbench, I knew one thing for certain. Julian thought he was dealing with a dying, obsolete old man. He forgot he was dealing with a master chemist. The decay stopped tonight. The investigation had begun. The industrial park on the south side of Chicago was a patchwork of concrete, tilt-up buildings and razor wire fencing. It was an ugly, highly functional place, which made it the perfect location for Dr. Aris Thorne. Aris and I had shared a cramped dormitory room during our first year of engineering school, 44 years ago. While I took my degree into the gritty logistical world of freight and supply chains, Aris went into molecular biology and toxicology. He now ran one of the most respected independent testing laboratories in the Midwest, handling chemical analysis for agricultural firms and private environmental groups. I parked my truck in his empty lot at 6 in the morning on Wednesday. The heavy steel door to the lab was already propped open, venting the smell of ozone, sterilized glass, and harsh industrial solvents into the cool morning air. Aris was standing by a stainless steel centrifuge, reviewing a digital readout on a tablet. At 65, he looked like a man who had spent his entire life under fluorescent lights. He was thin, sharp-featured, and entirely unsentimental. He didn't look up when my boots hit the concrete floor. "You look like hell, Artie. I thought you were supposed to be retiring to a golf course." "Not yet," I said. My voice was still thin, the lethargy from the previous weeks clinging to my chest like a wet wool blanket. I walked over to the steel counter and set the vintage aluminum 35mm film canister down next to his tablet. Aris finally looked at me, his eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses, taking in my gray complexion, the slight tremor in my jaw, and the way I was leaning my weight heavily against the counter. He looked down at the canister. "What's the variable?" he asked quietly. "I take 20 milligrams of lisinopril every night," I said. "For the last 3 weeks I've been losing my grip strength. My heart skips, then drags. Yesterday morning I tasted the pill before the binder dissolved. It tasted like silver halide." Aris didn't ask any follow-up questions about how I felt. He didn't offer generic sympathy. He reached out and popped the metal lid off the canister, inspecting the small white pill sitting at the bottom. "Gas chromatography and mass spectrometry," Aris said, grabbing a pair of nitrile gloves from a wall dispenser. "I'll run it against the standard pharmaceutical profile for lisinopril and isolate the foreign compound, but if it's systemic, it's already in your tissues." He pulled a sterilized phlebotomy kit from a drawer. "Roll up your sleeve." I sat in a hard plastic chair while Aris drew 2 vials of blood. He didn't ask for my insurance card. He didn't log the draw in his primary system. He printed 2 blank barcodes, slapped them on the vials, and placed them in a chilled rack. "I need 48 hours to run the blood work and break down the pill's exact molecular weight," Aris said, peeling off his gloves. "Whatever it is, you stop taking it immediately. You flush your system with water. And Artie?" I looked up at him. "If this is what I think it is," Aris said, his voice dropping to a low clinical flatline, "you don't eat or drink anything you didn't unseal yourself. Not a glass of water, not a cup of coffee. Understood?" "Understood." I drove straight from the lab to Pendleton Supply. The next 2 days were an exercise in extreme, agonizing discipline. The human body is an incredibly efficient machine when you stop poisoning it. By Thursday afternoon, the heavy concrete feeling in my limbs began to thin out. By Friday morning, the high-frequency vibration in my fingers had completely stopped. I sat at my desk, wrapping my hand around a heavy ceramic coffee mug, squeezing until my knuckles turned white. My grip strength was returning. The fog was lifting. But survival required deception. If Julian realized I was recovering, he would either escalate the method or realize I was onto him. I had to grant him the illusion of total victory. So, I acted the part of a dying man. I walked with a deliberate, heavy shuffle. I kept my shoulders slumped and my breathing shallow. When Julian came into my office to check on me, I made sure to let my hand tremble when I held a pen. "You really should go home, Arthur," Julian said on Friday afternoon, standing in my doorway. He was wearing a tailored navy suit today, holding a thick leather portfolio. "I handled the Dallas negotiations. The initial agreements are drafted. You don't need to be here." "I like to keep an eye on the bays," I rasped, leaning back in my chair and closing my eyes, feigning exhaustion. "The bays are fine," he said, a sharp edge of impatience bleeding through his curated sympathy. "Go home and rest." He left my door open as he walked away. Through the glass walls of my office, I watched him walk down the executive corridor. He didn't go to his own office. He walked directly into the corner conference room. Sitting at the table was David Sterling, our firm's lead corporate counsel, a man who specialized exclusively in executive transition, buyouts, and estate structuring. Julian closed the blinds the moment he stepped inside. I watched the closed blinds for a long time. You don't bring in the succession attorney unless you are absolutely certain the incumbent is on his way out. Julian wasn't just preparing for my retirement, he was aggressively finalizing the paperwork for my demise. I left the office at 3, playing my part, dragging my feet as I walked to my truck. That night, the house was quiet. Chloe and Julian were watching a movie in the living room, a picture of domestic tranquility. I remained in my home office at the back of the house, the door locked, pretending to sleep. I was currently taking inert vitamin C supplements from my secret stash, tossing the prescribed lisinopril pills into the aluminum film canister every evening. At 11:45 p.m., my cell phone vibrated on the desk. I picked it up, It was a secure, encrypted line Aris used for proprietary corporate clients. "It's me," Aris said. The background noise of the lab was gone. He sounded like he was sitting in his car. "Tell me," I said, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "I ran the pill twice, just to be absolutely certain," Aris said. His voice was devoid of its usual dry sarcasm. It was cold. "The pharmaceutical binder is standard, but the active ingredient isn't lisinopril. It's a highly concentrated form of digitalis glycoside, specifically digoxin." I closed my eyes. Digoxin, an organic compound derived from the foxglove plant. "It's a cardiac inhibitor," Aris continued. "In microdoses, it's used to treat severe heart failure. But if you give it to a man with a healthy heart, it slows the ventricular rate." I finished the equation, the chemistry instantly snapping into place in my mind. "It mimics the symptoms of congestive heart failure, exhaustion, lethargy, palpitations." "Exactly," Aris said. "And eventually it causes the electrical system of the heart to simply misfire and stop. Cardiac arrest. It's an elegant poison, Artie. Because when a 64-year-old CEO of a high-stress logistics firm drops dead of a heart attack, the coroner rarely orders a deep tissue toxicology screen. They just call it natural causes." The silence stretched between us over the line. I looked down at my hands, resting flat on my mahogany desk. They were perfectly steady now. "I have the certified mass spectrometry reports," Aris said quietly. "And I have your blood work. Your digoxin levels were deep in the red zone. If you had taken those pills for another week, maybe 10 days, your heart would have seized. You wouldn't have woken up." A cold, heavy stone settled at the bottom of my stomach. This was no longer just about a greedy executive wanting my chair. This was a calculated, premeditated execution. "Chemistry doesn't lie, Artie," Aris said softly. "But people do. Let's prove it." "Keep the reports in your secondary safe," I said. "I'll come for them when I have the rest of the mechanism." "Be careful," Aris said and hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time. The only light in the room came from a small brass desk lamp, casting a warm glow over a framed photograph sitting next to my computer monitor. It was a picture of Chloe on her wedding day. She was smiling, radiant, looking up at Julian as if he were the center of the universe. I remembered how much I had spent on that wedding. I remembered standing at the back of the ballroom, writing checks, absorbing the costs, believing I was buying her a foundation of security. I had been a fool. I had invited a predator into my home, handed him the keys to my life's work, and financed my own assassination. If I simply went to the police right now with the lab report, Julian would deny it. He would claim a pharmacy error. He would hire expensive defense lawyers, likely using my own company's money, and drag my daughter through years of agonizing public litigation. Chloe would never believe it wasn't a tragic mistake. She would view me as a paranoid old man trying to destroy her husband. To protect her, I couldn't just accuse him. I had to let him spring his own trap. I had to find out why he was doing this now, and I had to document the entire machine before I tore it apart. I looked at my daughter's smiling face in the frame. The time for keeping the peace was over. Protecting her now meant I had to completely, systematically destroy the man she loved. And I knew exactly where to start looking. A corporate financial structure is no different from a physical supply chain. Capital, like hazardous fluid, must move from point A to point B. If someone is diverting the flow, it leaves a trace. You just have to know which valves to check. By Saturday morning, day 5 of my silent recovery, the physical fog had entirely lifted from my brain. My hands were steady. My heart rhythm had normalized. But when I drove to the Pendleton Supply corporate office at 6 in the morning, I maintained the slow, shuffling gait of a dying man, just in case the security cameras were recording. The building was empty. Julian was at his country club, playing his weekly 18 holes. I bypassed the executive suites and went straight down to the basement server room. Julian had spent the last year modernizing our IT infrastructure, bringing in expensive consultants to transition our records to the cloud. He had changed the administrative passwords, locking me out of the daily operating accounts under the guise of streamlining the data. What Julian failed to understand is that I built this company before the internet existed. I owned the physical servers. I knew the backdoor network protocols the original architects had hard-coded into the mainframe. Within 20 minutes, I bypassed Julian's sleek new security firewalls and accessed the unfiltered raw corporate ledger. I sat in the glow of a single monitor, the hum of cooling fans masking the silence of the building. I began to pull the operating expenses from the last 8 months. I was looking for the anomaly. Julian was a man who lived exclusively for status. He drove a leased Porsche he couldn't afford and wore custom suits to warehouse inspections. He didn't have the personal liquidity to pay off a pharmacist to risk a murder charge. The money for the poison had to be coming from inside my company. It took me 4 hours of digging through heavily nested logistics accounts to find it. It wasn't just a payoff. It was a massive, unauthorized corporate wire transfer. 6 months ago, exactly when Julian began aggressively pushing for my retirement, he had authorized a lump sum premium payment of $120,000. I traced the routing number. It led to a Tier 1 commercial insurance brokerage in Chicago. I pulled up the digital PDF of the associated contract. The header read, Corporate Beneficiary, Key Person Life Insurance. I stared at the screen, the cold reality of the document washing over me. Key Person Insurance is a standard corporate policy designed to protect a business if its founder or top executive dies unexpectedly. The payout goes directly to the company to keep it solvent during the transition. I scrolled to the coverage amount, $10 million. Julian wasn't just trying to push me out to take my salary, he had weaponized my death. If I died of natural causes next week, $10 million in tax-free cash would instantly flood into Pendleton Supply. And since Julian was actively finalizing the legal paperwork to take sole control of the company through the board, that $10 million would effectively be his to liquidate. He was trading my life for an 8-figure payday. I scrolled down to the final page of the PDF. The authorization required a rigorous medical underwriting sign-off and the physical signature of the insured executive. There, at the bottom of the page, was my signature. I leaned closer to the monitor. The ink was blue. Every loop, every sharp angle of the A and the P was perfectly proportioned. To a casual observer, it was flawless. But as a man who has signed 10,000 freight manifests, I recognized the static mechanical perfection of it. It was an optical lift, a high-resolution scan of my signature stolen from an old vendor contract and digitally superimposed onto the insurance application. Julian had forged my signature to place a $10 million bounty on my head. I downloaded the entire file onto an encrypted flash drive. But the investigation wasn't finished. I still needed to tie Julian to the physical poison. I ran a secondary search, filtering the ledger for recurring payments just under the $5,000 threshold, the amount that required my secondary approval. I found it buried under a subcategory labeled Warehouse Medical Supply Consulting. Every month for the past 3 months, Pendleton Supply had paid $4,500 to a newly registered LLC. I ran the LLC's state tax registry on my phone. The registered agent was Trent Vance, the pharmacist. Now I had the financial mechanism. Next, I needed the physical proof. On Wednesday, day 10, I told Julian I was too exhausted to come into the office. I stayed home, waiting until I knew Julian was leaving for his weekly vendor lunch. I drove my truck into the city and parked in a narrow alley across from Trent Vance's independent pharmacy. I didn't sit in the driver's seat. I climbed into the darkened cab of the truck bed, hidden beneath the fiberglass camper shell. I brought my camera. I wasn't using a digital camera that could have its metadata questioned in court. I brought my vintage 35mm mechanical body equipped with the Zeiss Otis 85mm f1, 4-lens. It is a massive, heavy piece of glass that requires complete manual focus, but it captures light and detail with a terrifying, undeniable clarity. I loaded a roll of high-contrast black and white film. I waited in the damp cold of the truck bed for 2 hours. My patience is my greatest asset. At 1:15 p.m., Julian's silver Porsche pulled into the alley behind the pharmacy. Julian stepped out. He was wearing a high-end white golf polo and dark slacks, looking entirely out of place next to the rusted dumpsters. A moment later, the heavy steel back door of the pharmacy opened. Trent Vance stepped out, wearing his white lab coat, looking nervously over his shoulder. I raised the heavy camera to my eye. I adjusted the manual focus ring, dialing it in until Julian's arrogant, smiling face snapped into razor-sharp relief. Click. I advanced the film lever. Julian reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. Click. Trent Vance took the envelope, opening the flap just enough to reveal the thick stack of $100 bills inside. Click. Click. Julian patted Trent on the shoulder, laughing at something, before turning back to his Porsche. Trent hurried back inside the pharmacy, locking the steel door behind him. I lowered the camera. The transaction was permanently burned onto the silver halides of the film. By day 14, I had the motive, the method, and the photographic evidence of the accomplices. But an engineer knows that digital PDFs and photographs are only supporting beams. To completely collapse Julian's structure, I needed the foundation. I needed the forgery in physical, wet ink form. I sat in my home office and dialed the commercial insurance broker in Chicago. When the senior agent answered, I deliberately weakened my voice, letting it rasp and wheeze. "Arthur Pendleton," the broker said, sounding surprised. "Julian told us you were stepping back for health reasons. How are you holding up, sir?" "Not well, Tom," I rasped, leaning close to the receiver. "The doctors aren't optimistic. I'm quietly getting my estate in order this week. I need to review all my corporate policies, especially the key person coverage Julian set up." "Of course, Arthur. We have the digital files ready to forward." "No," I interrupted, making my breathing sound labored. "My estate attorney is old school. He's insisting on examining the original hard copy documents with the wet ink signatures for the trust validation. I need the physical file couriered to my house. Today." "And Tom? Please don't mention this to Julian. He's worried enough about my health. I don't want him stressing over the estate paperwork." "I understand completely, Arthur," the broker said softly, his voice full of solemn pity. "I'll have it bonded and couriered to your door by 5 o'clock. At 4:45 p.m., a secure courier handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope. I took it down to my darkroom. I put on a pair of white cotton archival gloves. I opened the envelope and slid out the original key person insurance application. I turned to the final page. I held it under a high-intensity magnifying lamp. When a human hand signs a document, the ballpoint pen creates microscopic indentations in the paper, known as embossing. The pressure varies naturally. But as I looked through the magnifying glass at my own signature, the paper was perfectly, seamlessly flat. The ink was laid down by a high-end commercial laser printer. It was a physical, irrefutable forgery on a $10 million insurance document. I placed the document into a clear archival sleeve and slid it into my heavy leather briefcase. I placed the developed high-contrast 8x10 photographs of Julian and Trent Vance, handing off the cash right next to it. I looked up at the calendar pinned to my darkroom wall. The annual shareholder meeting was exactly 1 week away. It was the day Julian planned to present my fabricated medical records to the board and seize total control of Pendleton Supply. He had given himself a deadline, and I was going to help him meet it. In engineering, there is a concept known as the point of catastrophic failure. It is the exact moment when the accumulated stress on a structure exceeds its load-bearing capacity and the entire system collapses. You cannot reverse it once it begins. You can only stand back and let gravity do the work. By day 18, I had assembled all the necessary weight to collapse Julian's life. I just needed the final certified fulcrum. I met Aris Thorne at his laboratory on a Thursday evening, long after his staff had gone home. The stainless steel tables were wiped down, the centrifuges silent. Aris was waiting for me at his desk, a thick sealed manila folder resting beneath his hands. "I ran the secondary and tertiary panels myself," Aris said, his voice stripped of its usual dry sarcasm. He pushed the folder across the desk. "The results are notarized and legally certified by 2 independent technicians. The compound in your blood and the compound in the pills are an exact, irrefutable molecular match, highly concentrated, digitalless glycoside." I rested my hand on the folder. It felt incredibly heavy. "I also made a phone call," Aris continued, leaning back in his chair. "I have a contact in the state police's financial crimes division, an investigator named Miller. We've worked together on environmental dumping cases. I didn't give him your name, but I laid out the hypothetical mechanics of the fraud. He told me that if a forged $10 million key person policy is presented at a corporate transition meeting to seize assets, it crosses the line from state insurance fraud to a Class X federal felony. Is Miller working tomorrow? I asked. He's expecting my call at 8 in the morning, Eris said. He looked at me closely, taking in my steady posture, the return of color to my face. You've completely flushed the toxin from your system, Artie, but tomorrow you have to let them see the ghost. They will, I said. Sunday evening, day 20. The night before the annual shareholder meeting. The house was filled with the smell of rosemary and roasted chicken. Chloe had spent the afternoon cooking, determined to have a nice family dinner to ease the tension of the impending corporate transition. The dining room table was set with our best china. I shuffled out of my bedroom, leaning heavily on the doorframe, letting my shoulders slump. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. The physical performance of dying was exhausting in itself, but the emotional toll of lying to my daughter was far heavier. Julian was already seated at the head of the table. My chair. He wore a soft gray cashmere sweater, looking every bit the relaxed, confident patriarch in waiting. He was pouring a glass of red wine for Chloe when I entered the room. Careful, Dad, Chloe said, instantly abandoning her glass and rushing to my side. She wrapped her arm around my waist, guiding me to a chair on the side of the table. You look so pale tonight. Maybe you should just eat in bed. I wanted to eat with you, I rasped, letting my hand tremble as I rested it on the mahogany table. Julian watched me with a look of profound, curated pity. It was a masterpiece of corporate sociopathy. You're pushing yourself too hard, Arthur. It's hard to watch you suffer like this, but tomorrow is the finish line. Once the board finalizes the medical transition, you won't have to carry this burden anymore. I should be at the meeting, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I built the company. And the company will always honor you, Julian said smoothly, cutting into his chicken. But David Sterling has all the transition documents prepared. I've already circulated the agenda to the board. We are going to vote to accept your medical resignation and transfer emergency executive powers to me. It's a formality, Arthur. If you show up looking like this, you'll only panic the shareholders. Let me protect your legacy. Chloe reached over and squeezed my trembling hand. He's right, Dad. I don't want them to see you like this. I want them to remember you as the strong man you are. Please, just stay home tomorrow and rest. I looked into my daughter's eyes. She was so entirely innocent of the machinery moving around her. She truly believed her husband was stepping up to save her father, unaware that he was the architect of my execution. The urge to tell her the truth, to scream it across the table, was a physical pressure in my chest. But if I broke character now, Julian would destroy the evidence. All right, I whispered, bowing my head. I'll stay home. Julian's eyes flashed with a bright, unmistakable gleam of triumph. He had won. The old lion had finally surrendered the pride. I'll get your medication, Arthur, Julian said, standing up with sudden, vibrant energy. You need to keep your heart steady tonight. He walked into the kitchen. I slipped my hand into my cardigan pocket and palmed one of the white vitamin C tablets I had been substituting for weeks. Julian returned a moment later, holding a glass of water and the small white lisinopril pill between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't just set it on the table. He handed it directly to me, standing over my shoulder, watching me closely. He wanted to witness the administration of his final dose. Here, Julian said softly. Swallow it down. I took the poison pill from his fingers. As I brought my trembling hand to my mouth, I triggered a violent, hacking cough. I brought my other hand up to cover my mouth, seamlessly slipping the poison pill into my breast pocket while dropping the vitamin C tablet onto my tongue. I grabbed the water glass, sloshing it over the rim, and took a deep, desperate swallow. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes, letting out a long, ragged exhale. Good, Julian murmured, patting my shoulder. His hand felt like ice through the fabric of my sweater. Just let it work, Arthur. 2 hours later, the house was silent. Chloe and Julian had retired to their wing upstairs. Julian had an early morning after all. He had a company to steal. I stood up from my desk in the home office. I didn't use my hands to push myself up. I didn't groan. My spine was perfectly straight. My hands were as steady as carved stone. I walked down the stairs into the basement darkroom and turned on the harsh fluorescent lights. My heavy leather briefcase sat open on the wooden workbench. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the small white pill Julian had handed me at the dinner table. I picked up the vintage aluminum 35mm film canister. I popped the lid off. There were exactly 19 pills inside, a complete timeline of attempted murder. I dropped the 20th pill into the aluminum cylinder. It landed with a soft click. I sealed the lid tight and placed the canister into the bottom of the briefcase. Next, I took the certified mass spectrometry toxicology report from Eris Thorne and placed it beside the canister. Then came the high-contrast 8x10 photographs of Julian handing a thick envelope of cash to Trent Vance in the pharmacy alley. Finally, I picked up the archival sleeve containing the original wet ink key person life insurance application. $10 million, bound by a flawless laser-printed forgery of my name. I laid it on top of the photographs. I closed the heavy leather flap of the briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The sound echoed in the quiet basement like a cell door slamming. Everything was in focus. The chemistry was locked. The documentation was flawless. Julian believed I was upstairs, slowly slipping into a medicated failure, too weak to fight, too oblivious to understand. He was going to walk into my boardroom tomorrow at 9 o'clock and confidently present a false narrative to the men and women I had worked with for 3 decades. He had demanded my power. Tomorrow, I was going to give him my evidence. At 9:00 a.m. on Monday morning, the executive boardroom of Pendleton Supply and Logistics was silent, save for the hum of the projector. I stood in the hallway, listening through the heavy oak doors. Julian was speaking. His voice was pitched to the perfect frequency of rehearsed corporate grief. Arthur built this company with his bare hands, Julian was saying to the 12 assembled board members. But over the last 3 weeks, we've all seen the tragic, undeniable reality of his decline. His heart is failing. His cognitive focus is slipping. It breaks my wife's heart, and it breaks mine. But Pendleton Supply cannot pause. The Dallas contract requires aggressive, fully capable leadership. For Arthur's sake, and for the sake of the shareholders, I am asking you to vote on the Emergency Medical Transition Resolution. David Sterling, the corporate succession attorney, cleared his throat. I have the transfer documents prepared, Julian. Assuming a majority vote, executive powers will shift to you immediately, pending Arthur's formal medical resignation. I placed my hand on the brass handle of the door. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of my healthy heart. I pushed the doors open. The heavy wood swung inward with a low groan. 12 heads turned toward the entrance. Julian, standing at the head of the long glass table in a charcoal suit, stopped mid-sentence. I was not shuffling. I was not leaning on the doorframe. I was wearing a tailored navy blue suit I hadn't worn in 5 years, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared. I carried my heavy leather briefcase in my right hand, my grip like iron. Julian's curated mask of sympathy slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of absolute panicked confusion. He recovered quickly, stepping forward with his hands raised in a pacifying gesture. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here? Chloe said you were bedridden. You shouldn't be out of the house in your condition. You're going to have an episode." "My condition is excellent, Julian," I said, my voice resonating with the deep, gravelly authority I'd used to run this company for 3 decades. I walked into the room. The board members watched in stunned silence. The dying man they had been briefed on was nowhere to be seen. I walked directly to the opposite end of the glass table. I set my leather briefcase down. The brass lock snapped open with a sharp, echoing crack. "Gentlemen," I said, looking around the room, "Julian is correct about one thing. He has been waiting for my heart to fail, but he grew impatient with nature. So, he decided to induce it artificially." "Arthur, this is a paranoid delusion," Julian interrupted, his voice rising in volume. He looked at David Sterling. "David, his mind is going. We need to call an ambulance." I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the clear archival sleeve containing the original key person life insurance application. I slid it down the length of the glass table. It stopped directly in front of David Sterling. "That is a $10 million key person corporate life insurance policy," I said calmly, Purchased 6 months ago using unauthorized company funds. The beneficiary is Pendleton Supply, the company Julian was minutes away from legally controlling. The signature at the bottom is a high-resolution laser optical lift. A forgery. David Sterling, a lawyer whose entire career relied on avoiding federal fraud charges, looked down at the document. He recognized the lack of ballpoint embossing immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step away from Julian. Julian gripped the edge of the glass table. "That's absurd. You signed that in my office." I reached into the briefcase again. I pulled out the certified, notarized toxicology report and tossed it onto the center of the table. "That is a certified mass spectrometry panel run by an independent laboratory." I continued, my voice never rising above a steady mechanical calm. "It confirms that my blood contains lethal levels of digitalis glycoside, specifically digoxin, a cardiac inhibitor used to mimic congestive heart failure. I was given less than 10 days to live." The boardroom erupted into a low murmur of shock. One of the senior logistics directors stood up, staring at Julian. Julian's face had gone the color of wet ash. "You're insane. If you're sick, it's because of your medication. Talk to your pharmacy. I have nothing to do with—" I pulled out the high-contrast 8x10 black and white photographs and spread them across the glass. Julian in the alley. Julian handing the thick white envelope of cash to Trent Vance. "Trent Vance," I said, "your golfing partner, the man who compounds my prescriptions." Julian stared at the photographs. The absolute, irrefutable clarity of the Zeiss lens had captured the greedy, arrogant smirk on his face perfectly. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The catastrophic failure of his entire structure was happening in real time. Finally, I reached into the briefcase one last time. I pulled out the vintage aluminum 35mm film canister. I set it gently on the glass table. It made a soft clink. "There are 20 pills inside that canister, Julian," I said softly. "I didn't swallow a single one after Tuesday. I kept them all, every single dose of the poison you personally handed me at my dining room table while my daughter was in the room." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The air felt thick, heavy with the gravity of attempted murder. Julian looked around the room, searching for an ally, a loophole, an exit, but the evidence chain was unbroken. The heavy oak doors opened a second time. 3 men in dark suits walked in. The man in the lead flashed a silver badge. "Julian Hayes? I'm Investigator Miller with the State Police Financial Crimes Division. We're working in conjunction with the District Attorney's Major Crimes Unit." Julian stumbled backward, bumping into the whiteboard. "No, wait. This is a corporate dispute. My father-in-law is trying to push me out." "Mr. Vance was taken into custody at his pharmacy 30 minutes ago," Miller said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's already cooperating. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." A plainclothes detective stepped forward, grabbed Julian's wrists, and clamped the steel handcuffs shut. The sound was sharp and final. Julian didn't fight. The arrogance had entirely drained from his posture, leaving only the hollow, terrified shell of a man who realized he had walked blindly into a meticulously engineered trap. As the detectives marched him toward the door, Julian looked back at me. "Arthur," he whispered, a pathetic, desperate plea. "You thought I was obsolete, Julian," I said, my voice cold. "But you forgot I'm a chemist. I know how to isolate a toxic element." They let him out. David Sterling immediately began making frantic calls to nullify the board transition. The board members looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and quiet terror. I didn't stay to bask in it. I picked up my empty briefcase and walked out. The hardest part was not dismantling Julian. It was breaking the news to Chloe. When I arrived back at the house, I sat her down at the same dining room table where Julian had handed me the poisoned pill the night before. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I didn't employ cruelty either. I laid out the lab reports. I showed her the photographs. I told her the truth about the man she had married. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She simply folded in on herself, weeping with a quiet, devastating grief. I held my daughter for 3 hours as she mourned the death of an illusion. It was the heaviest burden I had ever carried, far worse than the poison. But sometimes, a parent's job is to endure the pain of setting a broken bone so that it can finally heal correctly. A week later, the house was quiet. Chloe had filed for an annulment and moved into the guest wing while she looked for her own apartment. She was fragile, but the toxic element had been removed from her life. Julian was sitting in a county jail cell, denied bail, facing 30 years for attempted murder and federal wire fraud. I stood in the dim red glow of my basement darkroom. I was developing a final print from the roll of film I had shot in the alley. I used the bamboo tongs to slide the exposed photographic paper into the tray of developer fluid. I watched the blank white paper closely. Slowly, the chemical reaction began. The silver halides darkened in response to the light they had captured days ago. The shadows formed first, followed by the mid-tones, until the sharp, undeniable truth of the image permanently fixed itself onto the paper. Patience is a difficult discipline. When you know you are being wronged, the instinct is to shout, to strike back immediately, to demand the world see your pain. But shouting is just noise. True justice requires you to stay quiet in the dark, gathering the elements, calculating the weight, and waiting for the exact right moment to let the light in. I pulled the finished photograph from the tray, rinsed it in the water bath, and hung it on the line to dry. My hands were perfectly steady.